George Welch pulled the stick back over Edwards Air Force Base on the 25th of May, 1953, and the F-100 Super Sabre punched through Mach 1 in level flight. No dive, no cheating gravity for speed. Straight and level, on the power of a single Pratt & Whitney J-57, first production fighter in history to do it. 13 years later, that same airframe, the hottest thing in the sky when Eisenhower took office, flew 360,000 combat sorties in Vietnam at treetop altitude, dropping napalm and cluster munitions at speeds a Mustang pilot would have recognized. The fastest fighter of 1953 became the most dangerous close air support platform of 1966, and nobody at North American Aviation ever designed it for either job. The sortie count alone should have been impossible. By the mid-60s, the F-100 had already been superseded by the F-105 Thunder Chief, the F-4 Phantom, a whole generation of aircraft built to fly higher, faster, carry more. The Super Sabre should have been sitting in boneyards across the desert. Instead, it flew more combat missions in Vietnam than any other fighter in the Air Force inventory, more than the F-105, more than the F-4, the airplane. The brass considered a second-line asset absorbed the bulk of the war's close air support burden and kept absorbing it for years. The cost tells part of the story. An F-100 cost roughly $697,000 per airframe in 1954 money. The F-105 ran north of $2 million. When you need sorties, volume, repetition, pilots over the target 4 times a day, you send the cheaper jet, the one your maintenance crews already know blind, the one with parts stacked floor to ceiling in every depot in the Pacific. But cost doesn't explain the pilots who flew it. The flying itself does. If this is the kind of history that matters to you, the aircraft nobody remembers carrying the war, nobody wanted to fight. Hit subscribe and leave a comment. Tell us what your father or grandfather flew. Hit like, so this reaches someone who served on a Super Sabre squadron and never talks about it. The F-100 killed pilots, not in Vietnam, before Vietnam, during peacetime. Between 1954 and 1959, the Super Sabre suffered a Class A mishap rate that made seasoned test pilots nervous. The early A models had a tendency called inertia coupling. Roll the aircraft too aggressively at high speed, and the fuselage, longer than the wingspan could stabilize, would depart controlled flight in all 3 axes simultaneously. The airplane would swap ends. Welch himself died in an F-100 crash during a test flight on the 12th of October, 1954. The man who first broke the barrier in level flight didn't survive the year. North American redesigned the wing, extended the vertical tail, added a yaw damper. The C model and the D model tamed the worst of it. Tamed, not eliminated. The Hun, as its pilots called it, never became forgiving. It landed fast, over 160 knots on approach, and if you got slow on final with that swept wing, it did not give you a second invitation. 47 F-100s went down in a single year of operations at one point. The Air Force seriously considered grounding the fleet. They didn't. There simply weren't enough fighters to replace it. The F-105 squadrons had their own mission. Route packages over North Vietnam, the most dangerous sustained bombing campaign since World War II. The F-4s went to air superiority and interdiction. Someone had to fly low over the jungle, mark targets for the strikes, loiter in ground fire, put ordnance on a tree line 100 meters from friendly troops. The Hun got the job because nothing else could take it. The Sabre dance killed more pilots than any MiG ever would. That phrase, Sabre dance, came from the sickening yaw oscillation, visible on gun camera footage as an F-100 departed controlled flight at low speed. The nose swung left, overcorrected right, then swung harder left again before the pilot could catch it. Each cycle amplified. The pilot felt it in his spine first, a lateral shudder through the ejection seat that built into full-body whiplash force before the aircraft rolled inverted and buried itself in the desert floor. The whole sequence took 4 seconds. Welch's death on the 12th of October, 1954, remains partially classified. North American's internal accident report circulated in fragments for decades, until an aviation historian located a copy in the personal papers of a retired company engineer in 1992, stuffed in a filing cabinet in Tulsa, Oklahoma, between warranty documents for a 1971 Chevrolet. The report uses the phrase structural divergence at high indicated airspeed. Back to Welch. He pulled 6.5 Gs in a dive recovery, and something in the wing failed. The canopy separated. He rode the airframe into the ground near Rosamond Dry Lake. He never touched the ejection handle. A chase pilot reported those words. The timeline didn't allow it. From structural failure to impact, Welch had maybe 2 seconds at that altitude and dive angle. The G-forces alone would have pinned his arms. 180 pounds of pilot under 6.5 Gs becomes 1,170 pounds of dead weight pressed into the seat. Reaching overhead for a face curtain handle under those loads borders on physically impossible. North American's engineers understood the airframe had outrun its own aerodynamics. The 45-degree wing sweep that gave the F-100 its supersonic capability also gave it a pitch-up tendency at high angle of attack that no amount of pilot skill could consistently overcome. Major Bob Missette rolled in on a tree line south of Bien Hoa at 300 knots, 50 feet off the deck, and pickled 2 canisters of napalm so close to friendly positions that the ground controller's voice cracked on the radio. The jellied fuel tumbled end over end for 1.5 seconds before impact. Missette pulled 4 Gs through the recovery, felt the heat bloom through the canopy glass on his neck and forearms, and was already banking for a second pass before the fireball collapsed. His F-100D model carried 4 20mm cannons, 7,000 pounds of external ordnance, and absolutely no radar. He found his targets the same way a P-47 pilot found targets over Normandy, with his eyes. The Tactical Air Command had tried to retire the Hun twice before Vietnam accelerated. Both times the numbers refused to cooperate. TAC needed 26 fighter squadrons, combat-ready in the Pacific. The F-105 production line couldn't fill that demand, and the F-4s went to the Navy first under a joint procurement agreement that irritated Air Force planners for years. So the F-100 went to war as a mud mover, a digression on the Misty FAC mission. In 1967, a small detachment of volunteer F-100 pilots, call sign Misty, began flying fast-forward air control missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and into Route Package 1 of North Vietnam. They flew unarmed marking passes at low altitude in heavy anti-aircraft fire, identifying targets for the strike packages behind them. The unit's after-action reports survived because a retired Misty pilot, Major Don Shepard, donated his personal copies to the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in 1989. Those documents record 34 aircraft hit by ground fire in a single 4-month period. Back to the main thread. The Hun absorbed punishment that should have grounded any supersonic airframe. Rifle rounds through the wing skins. 37mm flak fragments lodged in the engine intake. Pilots landed with hydraulic fluid streaming from the belly and flight controls stiffening to the point where both hands on the stick barely held the nose level. The J-57 kept running. That engine burned dirty, smoked on the ground, gulped fuel at low altitude, and it did not quit. 186 F-100s went down in combat in Vietnam. Another 45 fell to operational causes, landing accidents, engine failures, the old demons of speed and swept-wing aerodynamics following the aircraft into a new war. The pilots who flew the Hun over the jungle didn't call it reliable. They called it honest. It told you when it wanted to kill you. By 1971, the last F-100s left Southeast Asia. 18 years after Welch's level flight run at Edwards, the Hun came home to Air National Guard ramps in New Mexico, Iowa, Colorado. Anywhere the Guard still needed a single-seat fighter and couldn't get F-4s. The numbers don't need embellishment. 360,000 combat sorties in Vietnam. That figure comes from the Air Force's own Southeast Asia Statistical Summary, compiled at Headquarters Pacific Air Forces in 1973. No other fighter in the inventory touched it. The F-105 flew 20,000 strike sorties into North Vietnam, Brutal, costly missions deep in the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. But 20,000 is not 360,000. The F-4 eventually flew more total sorties across all services, but the Air Force's F-4 fleet arrived in volume 2 years after the Hun started flying daily close air support. Nothing else was available to carry that weight. We flew 4 sorties a day, sometimes 5. You'd shut down, they'd refuel and rearm the airplane, and you'd go again. Nobody asked if you were tired. A retired lieutenant colonel from the 352nd Tactical Fighter Squadron said that in a 1994 oral history interview at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, his name appears in the transcript. His flight hours do not. He declined to estimate them, said he stopped logging after his first 1,000 hours in country because the paperwork felt absurd. 2,294 F-100s rolled off North Americans' production lines between 1953 and 1959. Of those, the Air Force lost 186 to combat in Vietnam, 45 more to operational accidents in theater. Another 203 crashed outside the combat zone over the aircraft's full-service life, training accidents, peacetime mishaps, the Sabre dance collecting its tax year after year. Total attrition across all causes ran north of 400 airframes. The cost per sortie in Vietnam averaged approximately $870 in 1967 money. The F-105 ran closer to 2,300. The F-4 split the difference depending on configuration and mission type. The Hun's economics looked like a Korean warfighter's economics applied to a supersonic airframe. Cheap hours, high availability, parts commonality across every depot in the Pacific Theater. The Air Force officially retired the F-100 from Guard service on the 28th of June, 1979. The last operational unit, the 185th Tactical Fighter Group out of Sioux City, Iowa, swapped its Huns for A-7 Corsair IIs that summer. The maintenance logs from the final flight show a J-57 with 4,100 hours on it, roughly triple the engine's original design life. Captain Jim Gist flew the last sortie. He landed, filled out the 781 maintenance form, signed the fuel receipt, and walked across the ramp to the squadron building to turn in his helmet bag.